Chapter 4, three key distinctions. First of all, prescriptive versus predictive. Sometimes when people use the words ought and should, they're talking about what they expect to happen in the future. So if I were to say, for example, if I continue to do crunches on this Swiss ball, in about 2 weeks I should be able to do 150 at a time, because right now I could do 100. I could probably do 150 right now, but it would hurt. In that case, I'm using the word should in a predictive sense. I'm saying this is what I would expect in the future if trends continue as they currently are. I know what I do about my physiology and such. If I were to say instead, I should continue to do these crunches because remaining healthy is an obligation that I have to my family, then I'm using should in a prescriptive sense, in a morally obligatory sense. I'm saying something that's of ethical relevance. That's the way philosophers typically use the word should when we're constructing and evaluating ethical arguments and such. So if you hear the word should, it's usually not about a predictive matter, it's a prescriptive matter. And the same is true of the word ought. I might say, if I continue to do the crunches, I ought to be able to do 150 in 2 weeks. I could also say, I ought to continue to do those so I can remain healthy for my family, etc. Just notice that those two differences and how they're typically used in ethical contexts. Another distinction is between what we morally should do and what we're psychologically prone to do. This is a very similar distinction between predictive and prescriptive. If I were to ask you, for example, if you were to come upon a scene where a clippity-clop princess was descending from her castle on a track, where if she were to continue down that track, she would kill or maim Pooh Bear and an army man and a lizard and Luigi, I might ask you the question, if you had the ability to summon Batman to knock her off that track and then put her on another track where she would then subsequently kill Smurfette, if I were to ask you that question, I'm looking for what you think you morally should do, what the ethically correct thing to do would be. If you were to respond, well, I wouldn't be very prone to intervene, it's none of my business, I would worry about legal ramifications, I wouldn't want to get my hands dirty, etc. The question isn't how you would psychologically respond to the situation, what you'd be likely to do. The question is, what should you do as a matter of moral obligation? And so we'll look at scenarios similar to this one over the course of the semester. And in all cases, you need to think about what your moral responsibilities would be and what another person's would be, and not necessarily how you would respond from a psychological perspective. The last contrast is between morality and legality. Sometimes people will say, well, X is morally impermissible because it's illegal, or they'll say that Y is morally permissible because it's legally allowed. But good law tracks morality, but not the other way around. Just because something is legally permissible doesn't mean it's morally okay, and just because something is legally forbidden doesn't mean that it's not morally okay. And it's also the case that if you go from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, the law is going to change. And I don't think there's anything that magical that happens whenever you cross a jurisdiction line. So for example, if I were to fly to Oregon, when I touch down there in Oregon, both physician-assisted suicide and recreational use of marijuana would be legally allowed. If I were to get on a plane and fly to Tyler, Texas, suddenly in that jurisdiction, both physician-assisted suicide and recreational smoking of marijuana would be legally forbidden. Nothing magic happened when I was in midair that made either of these things morally permissible or impermissible. The moral status of those activities are independent of where a person happens to be. They're also independent of when a person happens to be. And so we can think about times over the course of history when things that were clearly unethical were legally allowed, and things that were clearly ethical were legally forbidden. So say, for example, in our own history, there was a time when it was legally allowed to own another human being, and at the same time, it was legally forbidden for women to vote. And so these are pretty clear illustrations of the point that we want to separate what's legally allowed and legally forbidden from what's morally allowed and what's morally forbidden. They're not the same thing. Good law tracks morality. We use morality to revise and refine law and make it better. We can't defer to the law. We're trying to figure out what makes the most sense from a philosophical, ethical perspective. So there's three key distinctions. Now on to the four dominant ethical theories. Fine.